Aloha, please join me on this journey of exploring puzzling questions in research methodology. For a long time, the experimental design has been the gold standard of research. Many textbooks assert that without experimentation you cannot imply any causal inference in the finding. Following this line of reasoning, the editorial board of the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, limits causal interpretations exclusively to randomized clinical trials. For all other study designs, methodologies, and findings, authors are advised to articulate associations or correlations and refrain from using language implying direct causation. Nonetheless, a randomized experiment is not necessarily superior to other non-experimental methodologies. Any dogmatic thinking is counterproductive to science, which is supposed to be an open system. For example, British statistician Ronald Fisher, the inventor of randomized experiment, was dead wrong about the relationship between smoking and lung cancer. Between 1922 and 1947, the prevalent rate of deaths attributed to lung cancer surged 15 times across England and Wales. In 1947, Austin Bradford Hill and Richard Dahl were hired by the British Medical Research Council to investigate the possible cause of this pandemic. Obviously, it is unethical to conduct a randomized experiment, such as randomly assigning 3,000 healthy people to the smoking group and 3,000 to the control group. Alternatively, Hill and Dahl conducted surveys in the hospitals of London. Dahl was stunned by the fact that people who smoked tended to die of lung cancer, and in response he gave up smoking 2/3 of the way through the study. In 1950, Hill and Dahl published their report in the British Medical Journal, suggesting that there was a causal link between smoking and lung cancer. In 1957, Fisher, who was a smoker, sent a letter to the journal to repudiate their conclusion. His reasoning is simple. Without running a randomized experiment, we cannot assert a cause and effect relationship between tobacco and lung cancer. Fisher insisted upon his position and kept counter-arguing his opponents until he died in 1962. Nonetheless, at least Fisher was consistent by doing what he said. He kept smoking until his death. Experimentation has many limitations. One of them is that the experimental settings may not resemble the real-world settings. For example, Essek and his team observed the discrepancy between the real world and the lab settings. Many drug treatment studies last about 4 to 8 weeks only. Short-term drug tests may cost less to implement, but usually these studies do not yield the statistical significance that is found in long-term experiments. On the other hand, long-term drug trials have problems in retaining participants long enough to yield unbiased outcomes. In other words, the so-called causal conclusions produced in experiments may not reflect what would happen in the real world. The dictator game, which is used very often for studying morality and cooperative behaviors, is another good example. In a typical experiment utilizing the dictator game, the participant is told to decide how much of a $10 pie he would like to give to an anonymous person who also signs up for the same experimental session. The game is so named because the decision made by the giver is final. Most experimental results are encouraging. Many participants were willing to share the wealth. However, the result is completely different when the dictator game is conducted in a naturalistic setting. In a 2013 study carried out by Winking and Miser at a bus stop in Las Vegas, the researcher told some strangers that he was in a hurry to the airport and therefore he wanted to give away his $20 in casino chips. The researcher explicitly suggested to the receivers to share a portion of the money to another stranger at the bus stop, who was actually a member of the research team. In contrast to the experimental result, no one in the naturalistic study gave any portion of the endowment to the stranger. Thus, Winking and Miser suspected that in the past the setting of the experimental context induced participants to choose prosocial options. The preceding examples may be too remote to you. Let's look at some products that we consume every day: Coke and Pepsi. In experimental settings, most participants prefer Pepsi to Coke. However, Gladwell disputed the result by presenting evidence that this so-called Pepsi challenge is based on the unrealistic sip test method. Most tasters would favor the sweeter of two beverages when they make a single sip only, but the result is reversed when the entire can or bottle is consumed. Indeed, I am skeptical of this type of taste tests, including wine tests, coffee tests, and water tests, because our limited sensation may not be able to distinguish one from another while the difference is very subtle. In an experiment, the researcher tinted the white wine and asked the wine experts to rate the red wine. Surprisingly, the experts did not recognize that it is not a glass of red wine. At the end of the day, I hope you can see that experimentation is not as powerful as what some people claim, and saying that it is the best way to draw a cause and effect conclusion is dogmatic. Mahalo.